cutter's probably got 15 to 20% offline right now that's been damaged, and that's not coming back on tomorrow. That's 4 or 5 years to come back. So there's a lot of implications to this war that still aren't fully understood to the energy supply chain.
Well, it's a great indication of how interdependent we are. This is one of those great days at SmarterUmedia. We get to talk about one of those things that we feel, we sense, that we know so much about: energy. It's everywhere in our lives. It runs our lives. We're using it right now to connect. But how much do we understand about the marketplace, how it gets to us, the impact that it has on our world and on us? Not that much. Alan Smith is a true expert in the energy space. He's the executive chairman of Rockcliff Energy. He has helped found, grow, sell a number of energy enterprises. So he's going to help us understand the big picture. Alan, welcome to SmarterUmedia.
Well, great to be here, Steve.
Well, I will tell you that we'll get to so many parts of the equation. And I know you're not just at Rockcliff, you're also one of the partners of one of the firms that helps fund these ventures, which I think is an interesting part of it too. But before we get to any of that, I'm going to introduce you to our friend CT, who's the chicken timer. He's going to let you help us be smarter about the energy space in just 2 minutes. So with that, make me a little bit smarter.
Sure. As I reflected on what might just reveal to folks how a bit of the world really works, is there's about 1 billion people who really enjoy the amount of access to energy that we have in the United States. But when you really think about there's really an emergency going on the planet that people don't realize, and we would call that energy poverty. And just for an example, there are 3 billion people who only have access every year to the same amount of electricity that one of our American refrigerators uses. And what that really results in is it's not just a lack of power, it's people still cooking with wood and dung, like billions of people still doing that in their huts, which is a terrible health situation. It's the lack of access to healthcare, and because energy permeates healthcare in amazing ways. It's the lack of clean water. It's the lack of food, because we need machinery and everything which requires energy and fuel to be able to generate that. So there's still that we don't think about every day in the United States, just the amount of sheer energy poverty that exists and how little access that people really have to energy, and just how blessed we are. Just like they did a great job in Landman with Taylor Sheridan telling everybody that it's in everything from your phones to your shoes to your clothing to your makeup to how your food gets made, to go walk in a hospital. It's plastics, it's everywhere, and it's very underappreciated.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you hit 2 minutes exactly. You are a practiced person. You should come here and we'll help you train people before they do their 2 minutes on SmarterUmedia. You know, the fact that you start with such a macroscopic global topic is exciting, because it is one of those things where even our perception of what energy is so skewed by what we see. The fact that you say 3 billion people are living in a world that uses the equivalent of what our refrigerator uses is a perfect example to help you stop and think for a minute. What does that mean? There are a whole bunch of implications, but let's start breaking it down a little bit. We think about how much energy and the impact it has on us and the planet today. If those 3 billion people are brought to a place where they are able to consume more energy, that's a difficult thing to do. How do you do that? And then once it happens, how do we deal with it?
Yeah, so another theme that you'll hear regularly is we should be converting to solar and wind and batteries, and we should just run the world off that because it's renewable. And you can get off on a whole tangent about everything has an environmental footprint. Like, you have to mine all the elements to make all that work. But I think if a modern society like Germany can't make solar and wind work. In fact, it almost took them down. I did a little bit of research before this just to remind myself, industrial power in Germany costs 3 times of what it cost in Texas. And that's because they spent billions of dollars investing in solar and wind and then found out it wasn't reliable, it wasn't dependable, and it wasn't dispatchable. And that latter part of you, when you need it, you need it. You can't run on brownouts all the time, like a lot of countries ultimately do. But to your point, is that's why you're seeing such an emphasis on liquefied natural gas, or LNG. It wasn't that long ago, we were trying to figure out how to import natural gas, like 25 years ago. Now we are literally exporting 20 BCF a day. And, we're about 110 BCF a day, producing market. Obviously, it varies a bit on the demand. So how do we get that? It doesn't cost near as much to regas an LNG tanker as it does to compress the molecule 600 times into a tanker. And so there's a lot of countries that are investing in that regas. Then they've got to build the infrastructure that we're so blessed to have in the United States to get that gas to where they can burn it, in turbines to generate it. Obviously, coal is still very abundant, and they ultimately have to have enough capital, even though everyone would say that coal is twice as dirty as natural gas, but it's better than the alternative, which is nothing. And so you'll see, a lot of the countries, and from China to India to other ones, that's they're going to burn a lot of coal to try to get more electrified. Because when you get more electrified, all the economies that have been able to do that and have more power, then their industrial manufacturing, their GDP, their overall economy grows and expands, which then raises the level of living in those countries and the ability to earn and to be able to lift them out of poverty.
Well, and it's the balancing act. So we're starting to get into the challenges of how you do all of that. So every time you take a step up the ladder to consuming more energy, then it has externalities. It creates effects. And trying society by society is one thing, but then globally to understand how those things match, I think we're trying. Right. I think it's hard not to believe that everything should be part of the solution, if that makes sense. We don't often talk about it that way, but I feel like we should. It's not, we somehow feel like there's a battle between sustainable new energy sources and what we would call traditional or oil and gas or fossil fuels, which I think is a term people don't like using anymore. But still, all of those things are a piece of the equation today. Balancing and figuring out how we do it in a responsible way is really what we're trying to do, isn't it?
It is. And energy policy really matters, right?
Yes.
And just again, to contrast two economies, Texas versus California. Well, Texas is deregulated. Texas has ERCOT, which can operate independent of FERC pretty much. And when you think about having abundant natural gas available, and then you take the policy of California is that we want to eliminate fossil fuels, and we want to subsidize and bring in all this, solar, wind, and all that. Well, what that's translated into, I just fact check this, is that, we're running on residential basis, we're running about 15 cents kilowatt hour here in the US. Well, it's about double that. It is double that in California. And that is a direct result of the policy of California.
And again, I feel like we get lost in the conversation, because I feel like the conversation, if it becomes one or the other, then we probably don't get to the best solution. And to understand that if you pay more for energy, that's one element, right? So it's affordability. I mean, I think probably energy abundance, affordability, the environment are all things that we're trying to balance. And so to do that in some sort of responsible way is the idea. Sometimes we get pretty set in what our point of view is, and we want to sort of think it's a battle. I think it should be working together. It's about trying to provide those things in a way that doesn't harm as much as possible, but at the same time allows more people to have more access to the energy.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. I would say at Quantum Capital Group, where I am, we say all the time, we need it all. And just a bit of a fun fact for you in Texas. So everyone thinks, well, Texas is that kind of dirty hydrocarbon state and all that. Well, there's this little website that ERCOT has called Fuel Mix. It's a nice resource if you are ever interested in it. But if we pulled it up right now and looked at it, and the sun's out and the wind's blowing a little bit, probably 50% of the energy being generated in Texas today is from renewables.
Sure.
Now, what happens is that there's a couple of things that we know are going to happen. Like if the sun's shining, we'll have a great amount of solar penetration during the day, but we're very confident the sun's going to go down. And so at 8 p.m. tonight, how are we going to backfill 30% solar in our grid? It has to be dispatchable, and you have to literally ramp up. Like we're about we can probably produce 85 gigs in Texas right now. Well, we have to literally ramp up about 15 gigs between 7 and 8 o'clock at night right now. And we have to have it on demand, reliable, dispatchable, because no one in Texas wants their lights to blink. So, that's why, and you can't just say, I want all wind and solar, and then, just put this variable over here and everybody go invest the capital. And we just want to use that natural gas when we actually need it, and that's back to what you said, that's a bit of the predicament of how we operate. But I just always think that I've shown a lot of people that, and they're like, I had no idea. And I said, well, you hadn't been to West Texas, and you probably hadn't seen all those windmills out there that are, quite frankly, pretty ugly. I grew up in West Texas, and so I have a big affinity to Abilene and Lubbock and all those areas.
Well, I think that is the holistic approach, right? And not understanding that if you don't have a way to store the energy that you use, that can't happen at night or when the wind's not blowing, whatever it is. On the other hand, like you said, a large chunk is already happening in Texas. It's happening in New Mexico. I mean, these are incredibly powerful resources that used within a holistic system, they should be great. We should be using them because we're going to need an awful lot of power. And I'm sure at Quantum Capital Group, you all the time are looking at the expansion of need. And we know there's a just gigantic thing coming when it comes to AI and these data centers that are going to be built that will have more need for energy in the US and other places.
That's right. What we're seeing more and more is the integration from the wellhead all the way to the burner tip. Like now, Quantum is getting more and more into the infrastructure aspect of how not only do we get it out of the ground and produce it and market it, but how do we transport it and where does it go to? And like you said, I mean, it's the whole AI thing. Well, you've got a lot of gas in the Permian that trades quite a bit lower than the gas in the Haynesville because it's that much further away or back, from where the real demand and pull is for it. But, that's why there are a lot of people going out there and building data centers that can use that lower cost gas and get it, get it into the fiber and be able to, do what they need to do with these data centers to really, that's going to burn a lot of power that can do a lot of cranking that these, large language models and everything are doing.
Well, I promised we were going to enlighten and help us get down into the granular piece of it to understand a little bit more, because we think when I flip a switch, I get energy, right? I mean, it really is this magic thing that we don't spend any time thinking about. You've been at every level, upstream, midstream, downstream of this industry to help me to understand a little more. You say the word Permian, you say the word, and what is the name of the Haynesville. These are formations of oil and gas. So explain a little bit more what the process is. If you're going to help me get that switch to flip and have it have an effect, I have to have all of that process work. So explain what happens in those basins as you get liquid natural gas, or if you're working with the oil as well. How do I get that? How do I get it to market? How does it get to me?
Yeah, so a very brief introduction to petroleum geology, but the Permian is known as the Permian Basin, and there's a couple of basins out there. If you think about the Midland Basin, you think about the Delaware Basin, but it was once where the ocean was, and so there's a lot of stacked reservoirs. And the way to think about a reservoir is if you fill the room up you're in with ping pong balls, and then all the space between the ping pong balls is what we would call the pore space, that over time that these hydrocarbons or fossil fuels ultimately, where through decay and all kinds of stuff, end up in that pore space. And then we were in the conventional world of getting it out of the ground without a lot of help for many, many years. And then you might recall that we had declined in oil all the way down to 5 million barrels a day, and we were doing all this importing of oil. And then we had the shale revolution. Well, the shale revolution is actually the source rock that ultimately charged all these other reservoirs where it went into that pore space I was describing earlier. And so then we had to learn, we knew how to hydraulically fracture, but then you hear the term fracking. Well, we had to be able to learn to drill not only horizontal, but put all kinds of stages of hydraulic fracturing in there. And when we do that, depending on the depth, then we either get oil when it comes out of the ground, when it's shallower and less mature. And then the deeper and hotter it is, it ends up being cooked off, and it's basically more what we call natural gas or methane. And so the Haynesville is a deeper basin that ultimately has a lot more natural gas. The Permian, because it's a bit shallower and the makeup of it ends up being more crude oil. And so we've literally taken the U.S. crude oil from about 5 million barrels a day in 2005 all the way to about 13.5 million barrels. And if you look at our total products today with all the condensate and liquids that come with even some of the gas, we're producing closer to 22 or 23 million barrels a day in the United States. And we're exporting 2 to 3 million barrels. So we are no longer a big importer of oil. We're actually an exporter.
Yeah. I mean, transformed the global market for sure. And certainly the case here. We remember if we're old enough, we remember the gas lines and things of that sort. And those have been transformed by something that was a new technology, right? New technology helps me find new ways to get through the process. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Multiple times. I mean, we did it with 3D seismic. That was a big game changer, right? From 2D to 3D. And then that helped us find more hydrocarbons. And then now this, and just imagine, to your point, if that additional 7, depending on whether you're looking at just crude or total liquids, but this crude, if that 7, you got 100 million barrel a day world market. If that 7 million barrels was not there at 7 to 8, just think about what we would be paying for, what the price of crude oil would be and how much gasoline would be costing. It would definitely be higher.
Yeah. And I was thinking you've created this market. Is it too simple for me to try to put the chain this way? Essentially, you have to go get the thing, right? And the thing can be whatever the energy source is. Got to go get it. I've got to then do whatever I need to do, refine it to make it so it's usable. Then I need to distribute it to all of the places that then people want to use energy. And then I need to somehow make that whole system make financial sense. Is that too simple?
No, I mean, as you said, I mean, it comes out of the ground and now we have to get it to the refineries. Well, because we were importing, a lot of our refineries were geared more toward a sour crude. And a lot of this shale oil is more of a sweeter crude. So that's been a bit of a predicament that we've had to balance and make changes to. But to your point, once it goes to the refinery, it gets cracked into a lot of different elements that we utilize, different petroleum products for different things. And that's ultimately how the liquid side of it works, so that we get it into cars and gasoline, and we get it into petrochemicals that show up in all kinds of plastics and all the variations of that. And then whereas natural gas comes out a bit more of a finished product, sometimes we have to clean it up. We have to get the nitrogen out of it, or we got to get the CO2 out of it. You're always dealing with a lot of water on both sides, it seems. And then how do we get that then to a burner tip of a utility or directly into a manufacturing facility that's burning that to run the processes that they're running to make the products that they do.
And so for me to get all of that to happen, then it requires this incredible infrastructure, this incredible marketplace, this incredible business that allows each step along the way to produce the energy that we use and continue to have a voracious appetite in this country. But there's appetite everywhere if we can provide it in those places, right?
That's right.
And
the demand is continuing, to grow, especially on the natural gas side, because we're in the process with the projects that have been, FID'd or final investment decision, huge capital LNG projects along the Gulf Coast. We're going to go. I mentioned earlier that we're at 20 Bs a day. Well, we're going to be going to, by the end of the decade, closer to 30 to 32 Bs a day of LNG exports. And so that means we've got to be able to produce more gas, to be able to do that. And I don't disagree that there's an insatiable desire for a lot of other economies to be able to step up, and which should also mean over the next decade that crude is not going away, that at a bare minimum, it will remain flat to slightly growing is what the call is.
yes, so the equation includes all of it. I don't think any model that could all of a sudden cut one off. And you've described some of the attempts, well-meaning attempts, right? People are trying always, I think, maybe not always, but most of the time people are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to sort of figure out how to make the planet better, the people better in it. And so you've expressed some of the times that has been perhaps a direction that didn't turn out great. But as we make this balance, if we're going to take the 3 billion people that you articulate needing to or being in energy poverty to bring them to some sort of different place, so the health effects that they're having by burning wood in their homes is not happening, then that just means more. And that too can be a challenge that requires us to address.
That's right. And one of the things that has been a bit inherent in what we're saying that is important to understand is what we call energy density. So when you think about energy density, the most energy dense thing that we can come up with today is nuclear. And to the point we need it all, well, there was obviously some accidents and some things that have really deterred people from wanting to do that. There's also a certain amount of cost effectiveness to it, which is why we've been trying to go to small modular, nuclear reactors. And, there happens to be one right there in Abilene, and Abilene Christian University, where they're doing a lot of research on that. It's still not cost effective. But if you think about the gamut of it, and just to put this in perspective, that, that's where you get the most energy density, really the cleanest burning thing we can do. Is we've done a pretty good job with it on aircraft carriers, right, for a long time. Then you go to the other bookend, and the least dense of what we use is solar. And so there's a great stat that the Williams companies came out with, is that you take a 4-well Haynesville pad, which takes about 5 acres of surface use to be able to drill these wells down into the ground and do what we do. The number of football fields that would be required in solar to be able to generate the same amount of electricity is about 7,000 football fields. So that's a great example of the energy density. So you can put in a lot of solar, but you're taking a lot of resource, sometimes farmland, sometimes other things, with just a sheer amount of surface use required to generate the power in a very low density way. So all that has to go into the making. And like I said, we've got about, you think about, we got like 10% electric vehicle penetration in the United States. There's huge write-offs by all the manufacturers of these cars that went all in on that. And they're just finding that what people really want is still to be able to, drive their vehicles. And you got that kind of penetration. 10%, it's higher in some of the European countries. But to your point, it requires energy one way or the other. You can't just go plug it in the wall and go, well, I don't have to go to the gas station anymore. And then you've also got to look at the environmental footprint of that car and the mining it takes for the lithium batteries, for all the other components that go into that car. But there's been a lot of studies done on that. And basically, you got to drive an electric vehicle probably, 70,000 miles to cross over and potentially be better than an internal combustible ICE engine. So anyway, some fun facts there just around all the things that we're toying with. But to your point, it's not just flip a switch or plug it in the wall.
Yeah, and there's not one solution, right? I mean, new innovation's good. So for us to find new, better, different ways to do everything from nuclear energy to coal, right? All of those things are a part of the equation. It's really hard in a marketplace like this, though, isn't it, to have a true sort of overarching policy decision, because every boundary makes that policy stop. So for us to holistically, and we've tried, I mean, there are things where we're trying to find solutions together in different ways, but it seems pretty hard to do an analysis that brings all of those elements together so that we sort of can try to be smarter, better each and every time.
Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, if you think about all the things that you hear about, there's obviously progress being made. Hydrogen is one that you hear a lot about. Even the largest companies in the world, like Exxon and Chevron, have what they call low carbon, or they've attempted this even around their refineries. You got blue, gray, and green hydrogen, and you can't. The hydrogen molecule is so small; it's super hard to transport it, and so you've got to be in a position where you're close to where you want to utilize it. So to your point, we're trying all kinds of different ways to find ways to be more efficient, finding ways to be more cost effective, but I think that what we all know, and one of the joys of capitalism, is the markets typically work and the markets are typically efficient. And the American taxpayer should not be subsidizing things to perpetuity in order for them to be functional and contribute.
Yeah, but that's not simple either, because what a subsidy is a very interesting question. So there are some of them that are tax credits. There are things that aren't that way, but the tax system itself helps choose winners and losers. So it majorly complicated to sort of distinguish that. I would say that it is our business as people, I think, to try to find solutions to everything from having low cost energy that's available for me to use so that I can live my life, and also something that is not raising temperatures. And we've danced around it a little bit, but I mean, I think it's probably not wildly controversial, though I guess maybe it gets back to being somewhat, that we're having some climate shifts happening in our world. What the sources are, people can debate and the like, but we sure don't want that to get much worse so that fires and swings in temperatures are worse. So we all want to be working on that together. And I think that has to be part of the equation, right?
Yeah, you're getting into some controversial territory there for sure.
Yeah, well, we're fine to do that. I mean,
and what the reason I say that is we had the greatest industrial revolution that occurred from like 1950 to 1985, and the planet cooled. So that's an interesting stat, right? And there's no doubt that there is some warming going on now. I don't think that anybody, in our business would say that that's not necessarily the case. We do know that the big emitters that we can have are CO2 and methane, and we know that methane is a lot more damaging to our atmosphere than CO2. Maybe you could say both aren't great, and that's what people mean by net zero on the carbon side. But that's why what I would say that all the different industries, to your point, is we all need to be good stewards of the environment. To be a good operator or manufacturer, we need to be cognizant of the emissions and how we can actually contain those, eliminate those. And in the prior company that I did run, the version before where we are today in Rockcliff Energy, we were trucking we built the lines to put the salt water in pipes instead of, it took like 3 million miles a year off the road from trucks, which is safety and environmental. And you go from low bleed, high bleed controllers that are emitting a lot of methane because you're using lease gas, to either low bleed, or you go to a complete air system. And Then we actually measured the amount of emissions we were having on location and ultimately got certified that we were a low emitter. And I think that there's just a lot of awareness around that. We've kind of swung on this whole ESG thing to hex cross. People want absolutely nothing to do with traditional energy or fossil fuels, to the recognition that the world is not going to be 80% electric vehicles by 2030. That the reality is that there's a great book out there. Still one of my the resource comments that you're probably going to ask me later, but Energy and Civilization: The Way the World Works, by a guy named Rockcliff, SMIL, and he goes into how steel gets made, how concrete is a huge emitter because what you have to do and when it cures and what it emits, and he goes into the food supply, and he goes into it's a fascinating read just about really truly how the world works, and it's always a trade-off to what you're saying, right? I mean, we want progress, we want progression, but we have to be good stewards of how we do it. And I think there's been a huge amount of awareness to that. Obviously, the states, we're in Texas, so we prefer the states to be in charge of a lot of that, not the feds. But I think that we've made a lot of positive progress on all that.
Yeah, but I think that gets us to the conversation that's helpful. So when we aren't trying to feel like it's us versus them, or it's this or that, it's one planet, all connected, and it's people on the planet who want access to things that make their lives better. So all of that involves trade-offs, just like you try to tell your kids when you raise them that you don't wind up having everything. You can't do everything all the time. So if you want to be a, Division I football player, that is going to take away from your ability to participate in other things. And welcome to life. And that's what you're talking about in the energy industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a great point there. Sometimes we get so fixated in what we have to do in the United States that's going to save the planet. And the reality is we probably have a lot more stewardship mentality than maybe a China who says, I need more power. I don't want to be reliant on other nations bringing me LNG. So I'm just going to build a bunch more coal plants. I don't have all the stats on it, but it's a big number, just the number of coal plants that continue to be under construction there. And as you know, there's no barriers that China, their atmosphere is different than everybody else's atmosphere. So it is one world, it is one planet, it is one atmosphere. Ultimately, I think that there are certain things that we can be a leader on. There are certain things we can be influential on, and we do need to do the right thing here. But to try to like the Paris Accord and other things like that, to try to put the burden in because we actually do keep score. We actually do hold ourselves accountable in this country for the most part compared to all the other places, and to say that we're going to penalize ourselves because that we're not doing exactly what we can't quite achieve or attain what we're after. And the rest of the world doesn't really, they just keep score a different way. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, then again, well-intentioned. So the idea is to try to make it so that the environment's better. And it's one of those things that we'd love to be able to do. How to do it is very complicated. So I think when I introduced you and said you're going to help us make sense of all of it, that was probably too heavy a burden to put on you. But I love the fact that you've been in these spaces and you've watched things like liquid natural gas become more of a big part of the energy equation. Can we separate that out for a minute? Talk to me about LNG, because it's one of those things we hear about, but probably don't know that much about. The process you described as being very complicated just to make it liquid natural gas. Explain the process a little bit more and how it's transformed markets.
Yeah. So as you know, and what you're seeing with the Iranian war, on the oil side, there's a lot of seaborne oil that gets moved around every day. And so you've probably heard the stat that in the Strait of Hormuz, that roughly 20% of the world's hydrocarbons move through that strait. Now, obviously, there's some different ways you can go with it, and exactly the number that's been offline while that has not been functioning. As an example to that you've been doing this for a long time. Well, natural gas to be able to, we transport it through pipelines in the United States. But if we want to move it from one continent to another, we had to come up with a way to do that. And just due to the nature, of methane, which is CH4, being able to do that, we've got to chill it and we've got to pressurize it. I believe the number 600 times down into, and it will liquefy. And then that's why you see those LNG ships, they've got to have the insulation so you can put that chilled, compressed, gas that's now become a liquid and be able to transport that for many days across the water to get it to Japan, what we call JKM, or to get it to Europe, what we call TTF. And then you get over there, then that's what they mean by regas. Well, then obviously when you allow to expand again, and it will return to a gas, and then you can use it as if it just came out of the ground over here in the United States and it was in a pipe.
And that process is amazing when you describe it. 600 times you're compressing it, and now you have to keep it at cold temperature. Tell me what temperature it is. And then I get that over to another place. I bring it back. It's sort of like one of those almost magic things you put in a cereal box. You put in the water and it expands, and now it's a dinosaur, right? I mean, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty amazing technology. And unfortunately, to build 4 BCF a day export facility, is probably going to cost you somewhere between 18 and 20 billion dollars. So, it's certainly, it's not cheap. And, we were just talking about this the other day. So natural gas right now, trading depending on, around, $2.60 or 70 cents. And wasn't that long ago, it was trading at $4, right? But that goes to a burner tip somewhere, a certain amount of transport to make that happen. Well, when you get gas to the LNG terminal, then you compress it and liquefy it. And now you're going to have some losses at sea. And now you got to transport it and all that. You're looking at, somewhere probably between $6 and $8, from the time it goes in the terminal to the time it comes out of the regas on the other side, which is why that, TTF over in Europe tends to trade between, if everything's normal and calm, between $9 and $12. Because that's basically the cost structure it takes to get it over there. Japan, JKM, a little bit further, depending on where it's coming from. Obviously, there's some Middle East LNG as well. You've heard about Qatar's probably got, the big train they've got over there. They've got, 15 to 20% offline right now that's been damaged, and that's not coming back on tomorrow. That's 4 or 5 years to come back on. So there's a lot of implications to this war that still aren't fully understood to the energy supply system and chain.
Well, it's a great indication of how interdependent we are, and we should talk more about that. I mean, it's a global market that you, Rockcliff and Quantum are a part of, right? So you view it that way, and how interdependent is it, and what do disruptions do to it?
Yeah, it's complicated. And I think that we would all say for a long time that it felt like there should be a geopolitical risk premium that sort of is built into the crude oil price. And it sort of left the system for quite some time. I mean, we've been sitting here in this $50 to $60 world, for a while now.
$50 to $60 a barrel of oil. Yeah,
that's correct. Thank you. And now that this, obviously, with what happened with Iran, what's happening with Venezuela, but especially Iran, you see this like, well, what happens if people can't transverse the Strait of Hormuz? And now you've got this disruption. Well, there's people who have intentionally, that's why we have a strategic petroleum reserve, and other countries have something very similar. China's been stockpiling crude oil for a while, for maybe, whatever they end up doing with Taiwan, or whatever they end up doing if they get sanctioned or whatever happens. And so it's hard to tell right now exactly what the ultimate result will be and what the price will actually respond to, because we've sort of buffered this disruption with some of those things I just talked about. But if this goes on, that's why you hear people saying, and I think the president understands that, and his cabinet understands that if this were to go on for 3 to 6 months, it will be majorly exposed, which means that, if you see where things are trading on the physical market at $150 a barrel or more, that we could definitely see the price of crude go up dramatically because of this disruption. Now, natural gas, on the other hand, it's being globalized, but it doesn't trade. For instance, you may have heard of WTI, West Texas Intermediate, and then you might have heard of Brent. Well, Brent tends to be more of the international marker that it trades on, and Brent trades at a premium to WTI, but it's not huge.
Right.
I mean, I'm talking a few bucks. But if you look at the natural gas market, which is the marker we refer to is called Henry Hub. Okay, then you've heard me talk about JKM, which is Japan. You've heard me talk about TTF, which is Europe. Well, the difference between Henry Hub, which like today, again, it's got contango in the curve, and high twos, but the contango in the curve is up to 370, 365, 370. And then you look across the pond, and I haven't pulled it up and looked at it, but I know when the war hit and Qatar went offline, with all those trains, that it bounced up to $25 an MMBTU. So that's $25 versus $3.50 here in the United States. And in Japan, it's 10 or 12. I think it went up in the 15 or 20 range. But like I said, when things are calm and things calm back down, you'll see those trade, and there's quite a disparity on a relative basis. Brent is 64 versus 60. Well, now we're talking about $10 or $12 versus $3 or $4. So my point is that natural gas is not truly a global. It's not trading on a global parity at this point. And I think a lot of people think when we get to 30, 35 Bs of LNG, and that the U.S. will become the swing, and it will begin to look. The prices here in the United States will ultimately look a little bit closer to what the prices look like in other parts of the world.
Because of the interdependent markets. If you can sell it for $25 somewhere else, you start going, I can sell it for $25 somewhere else.
And it's where we were earlier. We can't act like we have the reserves in the ground in the United States that are going to last forever. The quality of the reservoirs that we're drilling today we've drilled the best stuff. We're drilling the good stuff, and eventually places like the Haynesville they'll have more inventory, but it will be at a higher cost.
Yeah. And eventually over time, though it's a long time, the time horizon is longer than you may think. It's a great reason to be looking at alternative energy as well. You need it all. We're going to need it all. We want more. We have a voracious appetite for that energy.
I would say, generally speaking, in the United States, over the next 10 years, the cost of supply is going to go up.
Yeah.
And that will be passed on to the consumer, right? That's how it works.
That is definitely exactly how it works. Well, there's a book, Disunited Nations, that I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a very interesting read. And it sort of talks about it was written some time ago and really talked about the change that was coming, which is the change we're in the middle of. It used to essentially be that all waterways and the like were policed by and taken care of so that they were open by the United States. And the appetite for that, all sides of the aisle, has gone away. And so now we're not doing that as much. And the thesis is that will change how these waterways work in some of the ways we're starting to see perhaps already. Is that one of the things, as you look at the wide market and you sort of think, it's going to be harder to ship things all over the world, or is that not something that's in your equation?
Well, I think where it comes into the energy equation is, I'm no expert on the Panama Canal, but I think we've all heard that there's a significant amount of congestion there. And it's also a delay to get through there. That's why we've said for a long time, and finally some of this is coming to fruition, there's a lot of natural gas in the ground up in Alaska. Why wouldn't someone build an LNG terminal up there, and then you could go straight to Asia, without having to, go down the whole and go through the canal and all that. Or if you think about, where things come out of the Middle East and having to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, or all those different things. It's some of the reason some of that hasn't happened is because of the regulatory environment, or because for whatever reason it's been cost prohibitive. Due to the labor to build what needs to be built, or the skilled labor necessary, or whatever it may be, that it could ultimately, if it was there, it could change the shipping time and routes and things like that. So I think those are just a few of the ways that we could see it impacting energy.
All right. Well, looking into the future, we're almost done. Looking into the future, what do you see? What makes you hopeful? What makes you concerned? What are things that you see that I might not see in energy markets?
That's a great question. As I said earlier, I do think over the next 10 years that we will see more small modular reactors. I think we will figure out how to do that safely. It's not the intensity of the nuclear product or uranium is less. Therefore, you can get more comfortable that there's less risk, and these small nuclear reactors are doing it without all the high pressure and other things that the huge, large nuclear plants used to do, which is also making them safer. So I think they're going to continue to find ways to drive cost out of the system on those, and hopefully that back to the energy density, back to the deployment of what those can do and be in other places around the world could be very important and game changing. I do think that as we need more energy in the world, and we're not the only country in the world building data centers, then I think that when you think about clean, reliable, affordable, dispatchable, that natural gas is a clear winner in a lot of those, because you need 99% run times to be able to, with a bunch of decimals after that, to be able to run those data centers. And so I do think that you will continue, and we have a lot of natural gas. I mean, this country has a lot, and as does the world. And because of that transportation thing that you've heard, there's been a lot of gas discovered by a bunch of the big companies that have never been developed because of the lack of ability to really transport it. I do think that we're going to continue to try to. Batteries are but they're even playing a bigger role in Texas, right? You fill those batteries up with solar during the day, and you can have an impact if we're really going to put all those on a cost curve and look at how that really contributes to the energy mix. Then we're going to need it all. We're going to keep getting better and more efficient on a lot of those different fronts. And then last but not least, where I started with this whole thing that was from my good friend Alex Epstein, who came up with that statistic, Epstein. But you got the 3 billion people who can only have that amount of electricity access. It's a lot of the haves and the have-nots. Mm-hmm. And how do we make that so that the have-nots can get access to a lot more energy? And I think that there are ways, hopefully, to do that. It's not just do we have the technology, it's not just do we have the access. There is a geopolitical component to it as well, as the different regimes function in different ways. And we're obviously very biased here in the United States, but we think capitalism is phenomenal. We believe that markets will ultimately pick the winners, not the government.
Right. You did say that it's important to have both, because boy, does it get in the way if you're not allowed to do the things you need to do to build a market.
That's right. That's right.
Well, we always end and get to the end by asking our guests to help us curate our information better. So I know that we may have dropped one of the books in earlier in our discussion. So we'll make sure all those things will be up in the description so people can see them. But as you look at good information, and man, it's hard to find good information sometimes these days in the energy sector or in other parts of your life, what are things you found that might be helpful to me?
Well, there's a lot of folks who do research that do some really good macro research, but it's not all available to everyone, right? And in fact, one of these guys would probably appreciate this plug, but one of the research tools I use is called Criterion Research. And Criterion Research, and it has more data, raw data, about natural gas and weather and supply and demand and all those different fundamentals that I find it very insightful and keep up with that. I think maybe a few of your other guests that have said this before. An incredible resource, especially in times like these, that I rely heavily on is the Bible, and it's where get a lot of my I would say ultimately wisdom and peace and perspective, and sometimes more of an eternal perspective in what we're dealing with here, but definitely sort of permeates all of the attributes in my life and what I try to do around integrity and character and doing what we say we'll do, and our word being our bond.
Hear, hear. Well, truly, Alan Smith, thank you for coming, enlightening us, and helping us understand what is complex. I will tell you at the end of it, I still look at it and I think it's complex. And I don't think there's any way to disabuse us of that notion.
No, I think it is, it kind of falls in the category of there's so many variables that as we say sometimes, well, that's what makes a market. Right. It's not 100% predictable, and no one has the crystal ball that has all the right variables lined up each and every day. What we always say too is that energy is a very capital intensive business. So as a result of that, especially in the United States, it doesn't matter whether you're public or private, you do care about the stewardship, and you do care about the return on the capital employed. And that's our challenge every day, is to try to find those opportunities that contribute in hopefully amazing ways to the global equation, but also, again, being good financial and environmental stewards of what we're doing.
Well, that's the perfect place to end. Thank you for coming. Come back and see us. And if you get that crystal ball, definitely come back and see us. It is so good to meet you and to see you, Alan Smith. We'll see you soon.
Okay, Steve, greatly appreciated. Good to be with you.